Hi guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you how to find macro photography subjects during late winter and early spring. As a disclaimer, I'm no entomologist, no expert in nature. I simply just enjoy going out and taking photos in nature. I've been doing macro photography for a few years now, so I'm starting to understand where and when to find particular subjects. The images you see on screen now were taken in the last few weeks of UK winter. In the UK, the end of March is the end of winter and the beginning of spring. And it's quite a difficult time to find subjects here in the UK. There's barely any fungi about, and bugs are only just starting to come out this time of year. I typically don't do any macro photography around this time of year because I prefer to photograph bugs, and they're a lot more common around in summer. And at the end of the year, I always feel like I could have taken a lot more photos. So this year I've decided to go out a lot more to do macro photography, regardless of what the weather's like. Depending on where you live, the weather this time of year could be completely different to the weather I'm getting here in the Midlands in the UK. So in that case, I'll share my experience of finding subjects a few months back when it was snowy and icy here in the UK. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk about a recent trip to the woods that sort of sparked the idea for this video. So a few weeks ago, I went out to the woods and really struggled to find subjects to photograph. I lifted some logs over, but pretty much all I could find was wood lice, and I've got loads of photos of wood lice, so I didn't really bother photographing them. But after about 45 minutes of searching and almost giving up, I finally found something worth photographing underneath a log. It was a huge group of black slime molds, and the log was absolutely covered in them, so I was spoiled for choice. Because it took me so long to find the subject, and I'd never seen such a big group of black slime molds before, I thought I'd take my time with this shot. And taking my time actually benefited me, because I started to look closer at the log, which made me notice other subjects around, and I wouldn't have noticed these if I was just quickly scanning the log. While I was getting my camera ready to photograph a black slime mold, I noticed a tiny little snail and a globular springtail. The globular springtail wasn't staying very still, so I didn't manage to get a great shot, but I did manage to get a shot nonetheless. But the snail shot, on the other hand, turned out really well. It was moving around to begin with, but I watched it closely and then I saw it stopped by a group of black slime molds. So I grabbed my camera again, went in for a shot, and because it was staying perfectly still by these slime molds, I managed to get a nice deep focus bracket, and I could reveal all the details of the snail and the slime molds. I don't usually photograph snails just because they're really common and I see them about quite a lot when I'm in the woods. But I think this shot turned out really well just because of the slime molds around the snail. I think it was a really interesting scene. Once I got this snail shot, I tried to find a nice little photogenic group of slime molds out of the thousands that were on the log. It probably took about 5 minutes of searching just because I was spoiled for choice with the amount of slime molds. But I managed to find a nice group of slime molds where some of them were broken and then some of them were intact. Most people would want to photograph a perfect looking subject, but in my opinion, a battle scarred subject adds character and gives your image a story. This shot is probably one of my favourite slime mold pictures I've ever got, and that's probably because I slowed down and took my time. Sometimes when I'm taking photos, I tend to rush quite a bit, and I think that's because there's loads of subjects around and I want to move on to the next one as quick as possible. But in this case, I was struggling to find subjects, so I thought I'd just spend as much time possible getting a nice photo of this slime mold. So the moral of this story is to slow down, take your time and be more observant. After taking these photos, it started to get pretty dark because I'd spent so long looking for subjects and photographing these slime molds. So I decided to head home with 2 solid images. After this day, I felt a bit demotivated just because I'd spent so long looking for subjects and I only came back with 2 images. But about a week later, the sun was actually out, which is a rare occurrence in the UK. So that put me in a good mood. So I decided to revisit the same woodlands and do some more macro photography. This time round, I decided to lift up bark because for some reason I've never really thought of doing that. I started by looking under a log and I found a centipede, but it was running around way too fast to photograph. So I moved on and I managed to find this other log that had loads of loose bark on top. When I peeled the bark back, I saw something wiggling at the edge of the bark. So I peeled the rest of the bark backwards and I found a hibernating longhorn beetle in this little hole. I couldn't see the whole of the longhorn beetle, but I could see the face poking out of the hole, which actually gave me a good opportunity to get a portrait. It was moving around a bit, so I had to be patient and wait for it to be perfectly still so I could get a focus bracket to reveal all the detail of the face. And a few minutes later, I managed to get the shot. This put me in a really good mood because I've only ever photographed longhorn beetles a couple times, and I managed to get a really clean shot that day, so I was very happy. After this, I decided to peel bark off several more logs to see if I could find any more bugs. And by doing so, I managed to photograph a centipede, a beetle, a fly, and a millipede. I also found some bugs in different places, such as this ladybird I found on the end of a piece of grass, this wolf spider, which I found on the side of a log, and this harvestman, which I found under a leaf on the floor. Looking under bark is always exciting because you never know what you're going to find. So every time I went out to do macro photography after that day, I made sure to look under bark for some bugs. And it's not always bugs you can find under logs. You can find mushrooms, other sorts of fungi, frogs, newts, maybe even snakes. You can find all sorts really. You can find bark on tree stumps, logs, and of course, living trees. But I wouldn't really bother peeling bark off living trees because I gave it a go myself and it was pretty rubbish. Well, that was a waste of time. The best sort of bark is when it's loose, and that's typically found on rotting logs. And rotting logs are a perfect place for bugs to be because they offer food, shelter, and breeding grounds. However, I'd still check as many logs as possible because sometimes the ones that look really good have barely anything underneath, and then sometimes the ones that don't look very good actually have loads of stuff underneath. And a lot of the time when looking under bark and logs, you'll just find woodlice and not much else. But keep looking and make sure to look really closely as well because some bugs are really small and well hidden. The good thing about macro photography is that you don't have to travel very far to get good photos. I made a video about this topic last year where I did macro photography in my back garden. But I would recommend going to a nature reserve or a woodland as you have lots more opportunities to find subjects. A pretty decent woodland I go to is about a 25-minute drive from where I live. It's a fairly big woodland with about 250 acres of land, but I'd say half of the woodland is covered in brambles and ferns, so you can't really find subjects in those sort of areas. I generally stick to this one area where I can find tree stumps, fallen trees, and logs. However, I've been to the same spot so many times now that I've started to lift the same logs over and find the same sort of subjects. So recently I've been exploring parts of the woods I've never been to before, and I've managed to find quite a few new spots that look pretty decent. A couple of weeks ago I went right to the back of the woods and I found a huge log that had loads of loose bark on the top of it. And when I peeled the bark back, I found two big ground beetles underneath, and one of them was a regular black colour and then the other one had a bit of a purple colour to it. So I quickly grabbed my camera and went in for a shot of the purple beetle, and luckily the beetle didn't move about at all when I was taking a photo, so I got a deep focus bracket from the front all the way to the back of the beetle. Annoyingly, the face of the beetle was partially obstructed by some dirt, so I tried to move it out of the way carefully with my finger, but then the beetle started moving and then ran off the log and got lost in the leaf litter. This was my first time finding and photographing a violet ground beetle, so I was just happy to get a photo, even though it wasn't an amazing photo. That same day I managed to find what I think is a funnel weaver spider, and this was also under some tree bark. I feel like the logs at the back of the woodland are a lot older and no one's really touched them, whereas the ones at the front where I usually go are a lot newer and I've flipped them over loads of times. So I think it's important to explore new areas in the same location because I don't think I'd ever find a ground beetle or one of those spiders in the usual area I go to at the front of the woodland. But if you've explored every single area of one location and you feel like you're not really finding anything, then you might have to try out a different location because sometimes you'll only find particular subjects in a totally new location. The other day I decided to visit a new location just because I've been going to the same woods every time to do macro photography, and it was getting a bit boring. I was finding the same subjects and rolling over the same logs. I ended up going to a marsh that's got a woodland trail going around the outside of it, and I thought this was a good location because it's got loads of water, which I think will attract lots of different subjects. One of the first logs I flipped over, I found a little newt underneath, and it was staying perfectly still, which gave me the opportunity to get a nice detailed portrait shot. I've only ever found newts in my garden around my pond, and I'm no expert, but I'm guessing that this newt was here because there's lots of water nearby. Once I'd finished getting photos, I flipped the log back over with the newt underneath. And it's always important to leave nature as you found it. So if you roll over some logs, make sure to roll the logs back over when you're finished. And if you peel off some bark, make sure to put the bark back as best you can when you're finished. I saw a lot of bumblebees out as well, but it's almost impossible to get a photo because they're just constantly moving about. The best way to find bees and photograph them this time of year is by finding some flowers. A few weeks ago I found a patch of snowdrops in the woods and there was loads of bees and flies all around the flowers. And when they're pollinating the flowers, it's a lot easier to get a photograph because they're not moving about as much. But it can be quite difficult to get a nice shot because their face is usually stuck in the flower, so you do have to wait quite a bit and be quite patient. It's also difficult to get close up with a flash and diffuser because they'll likely fly off. So I'd recommend shooting slightly less magnified and using natural light, and try and stick with a shutter speed around 1/1000 to freeze the motion. But depending on where you live, you might not even have any bees about this time of year. So I'll talk about some shots I got a couple months ago when it was a lot colder. In late February, I went to my usual woods on a very cold, frosty and foggy morning. Around that time of year, and especially in those weather conditions, I'll be doing landscape photography and woodland photography, but I decided to challenge myself and try and do some macro photography. It was very hard to find subjects that day because the frost had sort of killed off a lot of the fungi, and there was loads of leaves all over the floor, making it hard to find stuff on the floor. But after looking on some tree stumps, I managed to find some trumpet cup lichen. Usually I wouldn't bother photographing this, but with all the frosty details on the lichen, I thought it looked really interesting close up. I also managed to find a lot of turkey tail and candle snuff fungus, which I found on tree stumps and twigs. But if you're struggling to find anything, a subject that's always interesting to photograph are frosty leaves. The texture looks really satisfying, and I like to shoot straight down from a flat perspective to emphasize all the details on the leaves. And you have endless possibilities with leaves because they're all over the ground and lots of them have different sizes, shapes and textures. But yeah, I think that's all I've got to say about finding subjects during late winter and early spring. The weather's getting a lot warmer here in the UK now, so hopefully there should be a lot more bugs out soon. If you want to support the channel, I've got prints available for purchase on my website, and I ship internationally, so anyone can buy a print. My website will be linked down below in the description, along with all the gear I use for macro photography. But with that said and done, I'm going to end today's video here, so make sure to leave a like, subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.